So when she first got back to America, Pearl Buck, she kept saying, you know, where are the Americans? You know, I see a lot of people, they look English, but I hear this is Irish American, Italian American. And she said she actually bored her friends by saying, where are the Americans? And her opinion was actually that there won't be any pure American for about 500 years. So with that said, she couldn't understand her people. I want to make sure I say this correctly. Do African Americans know one's people well, or are they disconnected from their culture? James Peterson.
Hopefully I'm doing okay with these questions.
You're doing fine.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. As Lorene was reading, I was zeroing in on this question of whether or not, or how do you arrive at the moment where you think you know your own people, right? If I ever say that I know my own people, hopefully somebody will smack me upside my head and say, look, you got a lot more work to do, Sonny. And I think the reason why it's a challenging, I can feel Pearl S. Buck wrestling with that, because it's very challenging for me as someone who, I didn't plan on being a public person. I didn't set out to be talking about the things that I talk about on cable news networks. That was not my plan. I trained as a nerd at the University of Pennsylvania. I was in the English department. You know, people in my department didn't do those kinds of things, so I didn't plan for it. I really didn't. I knew I wanted to do community work, but I hope that in terms of knowing black folks, I hope that I'm always going to be trying to learn and trying to learn more. I think the question is a little bit different from Buck's imagination in terms of Americans, because what she's seeing here, she sees all this fragmentation, and she doesn't see the kind of ethos of the melting pot, right? She doesn't see that. She just sees the fragmentation. And I think one thing that's interesting is that whiteness is one of the ways that Americanness has coalesced. And so a lot of those identities in her generation that would identify as Italian American, Jewish American, Irish American, they now identify as white. So there has been movement towards that. And I think actually we have to go back the other direction, where people are acknowledging their ethnic identities to fully appreciate the diversity of America. Because if we ever arrive at what America is, I hope it is something that actually can, and an identity that can encompass all of the folks that are here, which means it's going to have different moving parts and be complicated and be fluid and be not fixed. But for me, in terms of black folks, I better be doing my work for the rest of my life. There's a lot of stuff to learn.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, really quickly, changing indifference, I think, requires having a couple of different conversations at the same time. We talk a lot about ethics and equity and morality, and it's very, very important. But for some people who are apathetic about these things, you have to talk about pragmatics. And there are certain practical considerations for diversity in any corporate setting, in any institutional setting. And it's not about black folks burning down cities. It's about being the best institutions, nations that we can be. There are certain pragmatic and practical considerations. We're more innovative, we're smarter, we're more efficient. We will ultimately be wealthier when we are more diverse. And so I think that's where you fight some of the indifference pieces. I agree with Margaret here that prejudice is socialized and it is indoctrinated. And so that's why you see, when my kids experience racism in Central PA, it's literally kids saying, my mommy said to call you darky. My mommy said to call you this. My daddy said, I can't sit next to you. Like, it's literally them parroting their parents. So it is passed on. The question about miscegenation is really a complicated question, which is, how do we wrestle with the reified data you see in the census? It doesn't really map on to the actual diversity of our communities. And so I think that's a very complicated piece. The country lives and breathes and runs on that kind of rigid data, and I think it's going to take great policy changes to actually acknowledge the kind of diversity within our community. I say this to black students on college campuses all the time. You want the university to acknowledge your diversity, but you got to acknowledge it yourself. You got to acknowledge that it's not just African Americans in this space. There are Caribbean Americans, and there are Liberian Americans, and Nigerian Americans. We have to acknowledge that diversity, but in terms of getting out of policy, it's just really, really difficult. There's so many other things to answer. Learning models, though. Restorative justice has got to be one of our learning models. And for students out here, these students that we have in the 21st century, they walk into a classroom sometimes and it feels like a mausoleum to them. And so our learning models have to incorporate restorative justice, and they actually have to incorporate the kind of multimedia tools that students are already gaining literacy on every day. But I'll be quiet on this. Lots of great questions, and we can stay here a couple
We
more
got
sessions.
a lot of questions. These are really excellent questions. But we're going to end with Peter Kahn.